For thus were the days of their preparation apportioned, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with perfumes and preparations for beautifying women. Must have taken a long time to make them look good.
That's a long makeup session.
I'm kidding, okay? But in verse 13, thus each young woman went to the king, and she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the women's quarters to the king's palace. In the evening she went, and in the morning she returned to the second house of the women to the custody of Shaashgaz, the king's eunuch who kept the concubines. She would not go in to the king again unless the king delighted in her and called for her by name. Now when the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his daughter to go into the king, she requested nothing but what Hegai, the king's eunuch, the custodian of the women, advised, and Esther obtained favor in the sight of all who saw her. Y'all realize what that says about this woman? She took whatever the ones who were in charge recommended to her and said, this is what we think would be best, and this is what we think you ought to do, and she took their advice and did what they said. After all, who knows the desires of the king more than those who had been serving him for so long? But if somebody, if she'd gone there with the idea, I know better than anybody else, what do you think would happen? She'd have been out on her ear. I mean, you know. In verse 16, so Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is a month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. It's taken over a period of time. I mean, if you stop and think about how long it's taking, you know, for him, you know, before she ever got around, and how long then Mordecai would be waiting to see what was going to happen. I'm mixing myself up here. The king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. So she became queen at this time. Then the king made a great feast, the feast of Esther, for all his officials and servants, and he proclaimed a holiday in the provinces and gave gifts according to the generosity of the king. When virgins were gathered together a second time, Mordecai sat within the king's gate. I can't imagine why the king, you know, the virgins were gathered a second time, other than, you know, he made her queen, and then all these were gathered, and the announcement was made that none of them made it, and this was the one, or, you know, or if it's a prophetic significance, you know, referring to the bride, Israel, that's going to be gathered, you know, the second time, the chosen, you know, to be, you know, to go to the wedding. Now Esther had not yet revealed her kindred and her people, just as Mordecai had charged her, for Esther obeyed the command of Mordecai when she was brought up by him. In those days, while Mordecai sat within the king's gate, two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, doorkeepers, became furious and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. So the matter became known to Mordecai, who told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. And when an inquiry was made into the matter, it was confirmed, and both were hanged on the gallows, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. These three verses, the book of the Chronicles, book is Sefer, 56:12. And Chronicles is the word dabar, or word. Mm-hmm. So it's in the record of the word, or the record of the matters, and it's a record of those things that had happened. Go with me to Leviticus chapter 5. And in verse 1. Now today, if somebody hears, you know, somebody doing something or saying something, you know, or a friend is going to do something, they're going to break the law or do something wrong, and they say, now don't you go be a squealer, don't you go rat on me, or don't you go this, or don't you go that, you know, and they have this mistaken idea that, well, I can't tell because I'm honor bound not to, okay? Now that's really a neat thing that Satan has worked on the world, because according to Yahweh, if you hear something like that, you're honor bound to him to tell it, okay? In verse 1 of Leviticus 5 is, if a person sins in hearing the utterance of an oath and is a witness, whether he has seen or known, if he does not tell, he bears the guilt. He's as guilty as they are. May not be in the eyes of the world, okay? But it is in Yahweh's eyes, and after all, he's the one that makes the final decision, right? So this right here is exactly what Haman, you know, Mordecai is involved in when he overhears this. Now notice it says that he told, and then in verse 23, when an inquiry was made in the matter, it was confirmed. So it wasn't just on one witness, it was on the word of 2 or 3 witnesses, and they confirmed then what Mordecai had revealed in the first place. And it was written down in the book. Now doesn't the scriptures also teach us that when we obey the Torah, then there'll be a reward for it down the road somewhere, right? But he's not giving anything now, but we're going to see down the road where this comes in. In chapter 3, that after these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes who were with him. Haman, the Agagite. The name Haman is a number 2001, and it means magnificent. Okay? The word Agagite, which is a descendant of Agag, it's kind of like 91 and 90. Agag is 90 and Agagite is 91, but they both mean the same thing. And the definition means I will overtop. Now we don't really know. We don't, you know, who knows what overtop is? Believe it or not, it's in Webster's dictionary. I had to look at it. Overtop. It means to make of less importance by superior excellence. Didn't Haman think he was so much better than everybody else, and he's better than all them Jews? You know, he's going around trying to find a way to kill all of them because he thought he was so much better. Okay. Goes back to Hitler. They were doing the same thing, right? I mean, if you stop and think about it, everybody wants to get rid of the Hebrew people because we're better than them, right? Just like somebody would say to us today, well, when you realize that you've been, you know, you're in the spirit now, you've been elevated above the law. I mean, people actually believe it. Anyway.
That's what the law is.
Yeah. But before we go on here, in the verse 2, I want to go to 1 Samuel again in chapter 15. See, the other day when we were reading up here, and I think I mentioned that the half Torah last week was based on Purim coming up tonight. And in chapter 15, in verses 1, 2, and 3, it says, Samuel also said to Shaul, Yahweh sent me to anoint you king over his people, over Israel. Now therefore heed the voice of the words of Yahweh. Thus says Yahweh of hosts, I will punish Amalek for what he did to Israel, how he laid for him on the way when he came up from Egypt. Now go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have, and do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, infant and nursing child, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. Now at this time Agag was king over the Amalekites, right? Which means that he was one of the Amalekites. And the Amalekites are all those descendants of Amalek, who was what? A great-grandson of Esau. Okay. In verse 9, it said, But Shaul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep, the oxen, the fatlings, the lambs, and all that was good, and were unwilling to utterly destroy them, but everything despised and worthless, that they utterly destroyed. And then going down to verse 18, and Samuel speaking to him, and he said, Now Yahweh sent you on a mission and said, Go and utterly destroy the sinners, the Amalekites. Destroy the sinners, the Amalekites, and fight against them until they are consumed or exterminated. Why then did you not obey the voice of Yahweh? Why did you swoop down on the spoil and do evil in the sight of Yahweh? So he refused to do what he's supposed to. Go to Genesis 36 in verse 12. Said, now Timnah was a concubine of Eliphaz, Esau's son. Esau was a brother of Yaakov, right? And she bore Amalek to Eliphaz. These were sons of Adah, Esau's wife. Okay? Now this is in Genesis 36, right? Now we're going to go back here in a minute earlier and find out there's a prophecy in there concerning the land of the Amalekites when he is named even before he was born. Okay? Go back to in Esther chapter 3 and verse 2. That all the king's servants who were within the king's gate bowed and paid homage to Haman, for so the king had commanded concerning him, but Mordecai would not bow or pay homage. So the king himself is the one that commanded everybody to bow down to Haman. But Mordecai is not going to do it. Let's go back to Deuteronomy 25. 25. In verses 17 through 19. In verse 17 he says, "Remember what Amalek did to you on the way as you were coming out of Egypt, how he met you on the way and attacked your rear ranks, all the stragglers at your rear when you were tired and weary, and he did not fear Elohim." This is a statement that Yahweh is making to those people to remember what Amalek did. Remember who he was, what he was, okay? What he had done to the people. Verse 19, "Therefore it shall be when Yahweh Elohim has given you rest from your enemies all around in the land which Yahweh Elohim is giving you to possess as an inheritance, you will blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. You shall not forget." Okay? Mordecai knew who Haman was, an Agagite, a descendant of the Amalekites. And he also knows what Torah says, and you're not supposed to even remember them people, let alone bow down to them. So he's trying to walk in obedience to what the Torah says do, okay? And then we're going to see how he's rewarded for that. Today, I mean, in our society, how many parents today, even when we teach our children these minute little things about what the Scripture tells us to do and remind them of what they're supposed to do? And even though they don't get a reward now, it may come later, okay? And it may be in such a way they don't expect, and it can be so much greater than they ever imagined. Okay. So my question here then, when we go back, is this why he refused to honor Haman? I mean, if we think about, you know, the whole story written about him and what he was, makes sense. So in verse 4, or verse 3, "Then the king's servants who were within the king's gate said to Mordecai, 'Why do you transgress the king's commandment?' Now it happened when they spoke to him daily, and he would not listen to them, that they told it to Haman to see whether Mordecai's words would stand, for Mordecai had told them that he was a Yehudi." If he told them that, he said, "I'm not going to worship that guy, I'm a Yehudi. We're not supposed to take, do that." So they went and told Haman, knowing that Haman would do something. They're trying to what? Test Mordecai to see if he was true to his word. Isn't that amazing? Are we going to be tested?
Every day.
If we have made the commitment to obey this Torah, you think we're going to be tested to see if we're going to follow our word? You see how the book of Esther fits in with today's society? And in verse 5, "When Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow or pay him homage, Haman was filled with wrath. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him of the people of Mordecai. Instead, Haman sought to destroy all the Yehudi who were throughout the whole kingdom of Achashverosh, the people of Mordecai." Verse 7. Notice what this says. "In the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Achashverosh, they cast pur," that is a lot, "before Haman, to determine the day in the month, until it fell in the 12th month, which is the month of Adar." Now it says in Nisan, which is the first month. I know that there's a lot of people out there who teach that, oh, Nisan is a bad name for that first month, because it came out of Babylon and all this kind of stuff. Well, Nisan probably is of Babylonian origin, but the Hebrew form of this Nisan, you know what it means? The number is 52:12, and it means their flight. T-H-E-I-R, their flight. When did they flee from Egypt? In the first month. So in the first month, which is the month of their flight. I wonder if that's just saying their flight, and somehow or other the English people put a capital N on the word Nisan, and it became a name of the month. Isn't that simple? I mean, Okay. In verse 8, "Then Haman said to King Achashverosh, 'There is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from all the other people, and they do not keep the king's laws. Therefore it is not fitting for the king to let them remain.'" All them people in the kingdom, because they were different, had different laws, and he decided he better kill them because they had different laws, different rules. Verse 9, "If it pleases the king, let a decree be written that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who do the work, to bring it into the king's treasuries." So the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Yehudi. The king said to Haman, the money and the people are given to you, to do with them as seems good to you. In verse 12, then the king's scribe were called on the 13th day of the first month. Passover is on the 14th day of the first month, right? Mm-hmm. So this took place on the 13th day before the Passover. Okay? And the decree was written according to all that Haman commanded, to the king's satrap, to the governors who were over each province, to the officials of all people, to every province according to his script, and to every people in their language. In the name of King Ahasuerus it was written and sealed with the king's signet ring. In the language of all the people it was written. Whatever language they had, it was written so that nobody left out. That on the day of the 13th day of the 12th month, is that what it said? Well, we'll get there on down. And the letters were sent by couriers into all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all the Yehudi. Now, there's another passage of scripture that says Satan cometh to what? To steal, kill, and destroy. Isn't that what this is saying? So Haman was of Esau, who was the enemy of the Yehudi, and he's getting this king then to try to come against to destroy the Yehudi. Both young and old, little children and women, in one day, on the 13th day of the 12th month, was the month of Adar, and to plunder their possessions. And the word Adar means glorious. It can also mean fire. Numbers 143. Verse 14, a copy of the document was to be issued as law in every province, being published for all people that they should be ready for that day. Before we read verse 15, I want to go to Romans chapter 15. And look at verse 4. For whatever things were written before were written for our learning, that we, through the patience or perseverance and comfort of the Scriptures, might have hope. You know, Paul wrote to Timothy to study to show yourself worthy of workman, rightly dividing the word of truth. We're supposed to be studying the Scripture. And this verse tells us that everything that was written before was written for our learning. Does that include what we're reading here in Esther? Okay? So all that's written before is recorded history. Okay? So Yahweh orchestrated history to tell or to show what would happen at the coming of the Messiah. So this is going to show us what's going to take place and what takes place at Passover, and then it gives us a foreshadowing of what takes place in the latter days as well. We read Genesis 36:12, didn't we? That showed that Amalek, you know, being born as a grandson of Esau. Now go to Romans 9. In verse 13. He says, as it is written, Jacob I have loved, but Esau I have hated. Now if we understand that statement, if we bring it down, not just the two people that were in the womb at that time, but the descendants of these two people and everything that's going to mean. Because Jacob was the one who desired the covenant of Yahweh, right? Everything. Esau despised the birthright. These things are passed down to generations, and it's still happening today. It was happening back then. We see that coming all the way through the book of Esther, okay? Go to Malachi chapter 1. Now, this passage is quoting, you know, where he said it was, you know, as it has been said, right? So we have to go back and find out where it was written. In Malachi chapter 1. And in verse 2 and 3, he said, I have loved you, says Yahweh, yet you say, in what way have you loved us? Was not Esau Yaakov's brother, says Yahweh, yet Yaakov I have loved. But Esau I have hated and laid waste his mountains and his heritage for the jackals of the wilderness. And if we see those things, you know, coming to pass in the history, you know, back, we ought to be able to recognize what it means today when we see that whole thing. Go back to Genesis 14. in Genesis 14 and in verse 7. Now this is, all these different kings and so forth that were, down around king of Sodom and Gomorrah and the king of Admah and all these 5 kings, and they were going to be battling these other kings and everything. In verse 7, then they turned back and came to Ein Mishpat, that is Kadesh. Now Kadesh Barnea is on the southern end below Jerusalem in Israel, and attacked all the country of the Amalekites. Do y'all realize here is calling this country down there the country of the Amalekites, and they ain't even been born until Genesis chapter 36. So here is the name of Amalek being applied to that country of these people even before it took place. Okay? I don't know whether people realize that Amalek is mentioned in prophecy hundreds of years before he was born. In all of Scripture, go back to Exodus 17. We read this sometime back. In Exodus 17 and in verse 16, for he said, because Yahweh has sworn, Yahweh will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. So he is going to be battling Amalek. And everybody, and we've all been taught, we've heard the saying, all the battle is Yahweh's, right? But the victory is ours. What battle are we talking about? The battle he's going to be having with Amalek, those who are out to destroy the enemy of the Yehudi. Yahweh's battle is with those who are enemies of the Yehudi, the chosen people, right? And he's going to be having that battle from generation to generation. Well, if we have the victory, all we have to do is walk in obedience to Yahweh's word. He's going to fight the battle. That was another picture when Yehoshua was down in the valley, when he chose the warriors, and Moses went up on top of the hill with the rod and everything, and he held up the rod, and Yehoshua won the battle. He was fighting with who? Amalek. Okay. Amalek was mentioned by name before he was born. 2 others are mentioned the same way, and they all 3 play a role in the book of Esther. The other 2 were Cyrus. Everybody knows about Cyrus, right? And Agag, whom Haman is a descendant of Agag. Go to Isaiah 44. In verse 28. And he writes here, who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, the one who will do his will. This is written 100 years before Cyrus was born. Okay? So there is a prophecy in here of what Cyrus is going to do. And then go to Numbers, chapter 24, all the way back into Torah.
What are we doing?
Numbers chapter 24. Just as in the prophecy of Balaam, and Balaam was speaking, and he was, had been hired to try to curse the children, but he couldn't do it. And then he's giving all this, the word concerning Israel, or Yaakov, and in verse 7 it says, he shall pour water from his buckets, and his seed will be in many waters. His king shall be higher than Agag, and his kingdom shall be exalted. So again, it's a prophecy of the seed of Israel being in a kingdom higher than the kingdom of Agag. But here he is prophesied all the way back in Numbers, long before he's ever born. Okay? So go back to Esther. We were reading in 3 and in verse 15. That the couriers went out, hastened by the king's command, and the decree was proclaimed in Shushan the citadel. So the king and Haman sat down to drink. But the city of Shushan was perplexed or in confusion. Man, this decree had gone out, and all these Yehudi are going to be destroyed. And it's going to take place, some few months down the road. And the city's kind of perplexed. Can you imagine all the people trying to figure, well, you a Jew? Well, you a Jew? Well, if I'm a Jew, who's a Jew? We try and figure this out. They've been in Babylon 70 years, and now they're under, the Persian and the Medes, right? And who's who? After 70 years, if you're not following Torah, it's kind of easy to forget who or what you are. And now everybody's got to look at one another and say, what is we? I mean, you know, they're trying to figure this thing out. Wouldn't you want to know if there was a decree issued that all of a certain type of people are going to be killed? You'd want to know whether you won them or not, wouldn't you? Wouldn't you care?
There was only a remnant obeying.
Yeah. So now everybody got to figure out whose family am I in. Isn't that where we at today? If we in Yahweh's family, we're going to be all right. But if we're not, we are the ones going to be destroyed. Okay, chapter 4. So when Mordecai learned all that had happened, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out into the midst of the city. He cried out with a loud and bitter cry. When was this taking place? Back over in verse 12, they wrote this on the 13th day of the first month. This is Nisan, right? They wrote it before Passover, so all this is coming out, and Mordecai learned now, so we're still talking the 13th to 14th of the month of Nisan.
And the next day they were going to do Passover, and everyone would know they were Jews.
No, this was in Persia. Chances are they couldn't do the Passover in Persia because it had to be done in the land, remember?
Yeah, but you said on the 15th we did the Passover, and this was the 13th.
I say we do. I'm not talking about them.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Whether they observe the festivals or not, I doubt.
Okay.
Anyway, we're seeing it now in retrospect. Okay, from what it was. So when Mordecai learned all that had happened, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out into the midst of the city. He cried out with a loud and bitter cry. He went as far as in front of the king's gate, for no one might enter the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. And in every province where the king's command and decree arrived, there was great mourning among the Yehudi with fasting, weeping, and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. So Esther's maids and the eunuchs came and told her, and the queen was deeply distressed. Then she sent garments to clothe Mordecai and take his sackcloth away from him, but he would not accept. Now whoever this messenger is running between Esther and Mordecai is trusted very much when you begin to realize what the two of them said to him. You know, concerning the secrets that they've been keeping all this time anyway. Then Esther called Hatak, one of the king's eunuchs, whom he had appointed to attend her, and she gave him a command concerning Mordecai to learn what and why this was. So Hatak went out to Mordecai in the city square that was in front of the king's gate, and Mordecai told him all that had happened to him, and the sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries to destroy the Yehudi. He also gave him a copy of the written decree for their destruction, which was given at Shushan, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her, and that he might command her to go in to the king to make supplication to him and plead before him for her people. So Hatak returned and told Esther the words of Mordecai. Then Esther spoke to Hatak and gave him a command for Mordecai. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that any man or any woman who goes into the inner court to the king who has not been called, he had but one law: put all to death except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter that he may live. Yet I myself have not been called to go into the king these 30 days. So they told Mordecai Esther's words. Then Mordecai told him to answer Esther. Do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Yehudi. Just because you're the queen, don't think you're going to get away if you don't, go in for it. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Yehudi from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. So he's saying, you're going to die anyway. But he's convinced that deliverance will arise from someplace else. Even if she doesn't, it'll still come. I guess he believes the scripture, it says that he'll not forsake his people. He'll be with them always. Verse 15, Then Esther told them to return this answer to Mordecai. Go gather all the Yehudi who are present in Shushan and fast for me, neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will fast likewise, and so I will go to the king, which is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Then Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther commanded him. Now this fast that they're fixing to start here, when we're looking at these dates, the 13th is when this thing was issued, and then he gave it, he got a copy and he told her. It looks like the fast seems to be falling on probably the 14th, the 15th, and the 16th. Kind of right in that series in here. So in chapter 5, now it happened on the 3rd day that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace across from the king's house, while the king sat on his royal throne in the royal house facing the entrance of the house. So it was, when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she found favor in his sight. And the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther went near and touched the top of the scepter. And the king said to her, "What do you wish, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you."